I come from the humanities and social sciences. There's a lot of great work being done there. So our immensely productive research infrastructure in universities and industry that drive the U.S. economy, that help us solve the problems that really matter, that new technologies, new solutions to human problems. This is what's been so vital and dynamic for the United States for decades. However, for decades we had an open policy because of it was the luxury we enjoyed of having a predominant position of being the world leader. We felt like we could share everything with everyone, and in particular, by modeling that good behavior, we could encourage others to behave in similar ways. And most of our traditional partners were other liberal democracies, and so that seemed like a no-brainer. Countries like Germany, Japan, the UK, Canada, France, and others. But then suddenly, out of nowhere, emerged countries, non-traditional research partners that had really different political systems, really different visions of the kind of world that they wanted to live in. Many of them were one-party states, highly authoritarian, and China was the leading example of those. And for many countries, China is the leading, if not one of the leading, if not the leading research partners. It is for the United States. Far and away, the amount of international collaboration done with partners in China equals roughly the next two countries put together, the UK and Germany. And if you count those four countries, the U.S., China, UK, and Germany, you have the world's research superpowers.
Glenn, how's it going, man?
Great. Thanks for inviting me to be on the show.
I'm super excited to have you on today. There's so much to talk about in regard to China, but I was just hoping maybe you could start with a quick introduction so that people know who you are.
Gladly. So I'm Glenn Tiffert, a Distinguished Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, which is a public policy think tank based at Stanford University. My training is as a historian of China, but I also co-chair our program on the U.S., China, and the world, along with my colleague Elizabeth Economy, who's recently back from serving in the administration. And together we have a comprehensive program on China that looks at China domestically, that looks particularly at U.S. competitiveness around the world with regards to China in technology and key sectors of our economy. And then also the third pillar is the competition globally for narratives, influence, and systemic structures of the international system.
Awesome. In researching, kind of getting prepared for this podcast, I just started digging into China. And the more you dig in, the more I think that we aren't thinking about China the right way. Let me just list out some of the issues that we have with China. It's so pervasive that I think it leaves a lot of people befuddled. IP theft, human rights abuses, economic influence, university cheating, research theft, large-scale espionage, ocean pollution, CO2 emissions, an alliance with Russia, and one that I think is actually really interesting and kind of caught my eye was illicit fishing. So there's so many different issues happening with China. My first question for you is, are we even thinking about China the right way? And what's wrong with the way the U.S. population generally thinks about China?
I think large segments of our policymakers are alert to the comprehensiveness of the challenge that China poses to the United States, but we haven't been seized by appropriate urgency. And we're having real challenges mobilizing and coordinating ourselves so that we can begin to execute on the things that we need to do to effectively compete across the board with China. The American public is being exposed to China largely through the lens of economic competitiveness, that it's the flow of goods, particularly supply chains, and then also about military competition, especially with regards to Taiwan. But as you suggested, China is active in the world in a range of ways that tend not to show up in the headlines. And so for the United States, and what I spend a lot of my time doing is trying to help us begin to solve our coordination problems and understand that this is a broad, full spectrum challenge of the sort that we've never really faced before, even including the period of the Cold War where we were in rivalry with the Soviet Union. You'll recall that the Soviet Union was a military superpower, but economically it was really quite weak. China is militarily, technologically, and economically a near peer competitor with the United States. We've never been in this territory before.
Yeah, you mentioned near peer competitor. That's something I hear a lot in the military space. If we're talking about the way people are thinking about China, how should our military and intelligence leaders think about China? Obviously, there's the raw data, right? Just understanding the movements of their military and navy and all that good stuff. But how does China think about warfare? Do they even think that a hot war with the United States is a possibility?
Yeah, that's the big question. I would say the following. The flashpoint that is probably most acute militarily is in the South China Sea involving Taiwan's status and China's claims over Taiwan. As your audience is probably aware, China regards Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually reunite with the motherland. The United States takes a different view. The United States would like to preserve the freedom of Taiwan's people to choose their own destiny, and hopefully at some indeterminate point in the future for there to be a peaceful resolution of the status of Taiwan. Now, China, and particularly under Xi Jinping, has been very methodically laying down the groundwork brick by brick to create a military option that it could exercise at some point in the future. They're not quite there yet, but they very likely will be in the next 5 to 8 years, in which case if Xi Jinping woke up one morning and said, you know what, I'm going to go for it, he'll have all of the ingredients in place to do that. And so it's really incumbent on the United States to shore up the deterrence that we've preserved in that region really since the end of World War II regarding Taiwan. And we have that opportunity now if we step up really quickly. The ball in some senses in our court. You know, it's worth reflecting on the war in Ukraine after the Russians seized Crimea. And there was a period of time in which Europe and the United States could have mobilized to do much more to maintain deterrence in that region. But clearly deterrence failed, and Putin sensed that he had an opportunity to make a move on all of Ukraine, and he did. We face a similar opportunity right now to shore up deterrence in the region so that Xi Jinping says, you know what, there's sufficient uncertainty that even with all the hard work and money that I have spent building the military option, that I could prevail at acceptable cost in an acceptable time frame. And that's where we want to be. So we've got to invest hard because we are losing our edge right now in that region.
When you mentioned Taiwan, how do the people of Taiwan feel about China?
That's a great question. Taiwan's an incredibly vibrant, pluralistic democracy. It is, in a sense, one of the world's best success stories for a transition from a one-party authoritarian state into a socially progressive, economically liberal, vibrant, pluralistic electoral democracy. You couldn't do it any better than the way they did it peacefully. And that in and of itself is deeply threatening to the PRC because it demonstrates that there's nothing incompatible between Chinese culture and electoral liberal democracy. Taiwan has pulled it off and done it quite well. And if you look, they're executing brilliantly on high technology. So it's not even like they had to give up anything economically to achieve that. This is intolerable to a one-party authoritarian state like the CCP's regime in China. And the people of Taiwan generationally, because there's all this great public polling because it's a free society, there's a generational split in Taiwan in which older people will feel more of an ethnic Chinese identity and an affiliation with a greater Chinese population and a connection to the mainland and China and the PRC. A large segment of Taiwan's population fled the mainland in 1949 when the nationalist government collapsed. And they tended to be those who dominated political and cultural spaces for several decades thereafter in Taiwan. Their descendants, up until quite recently, still felt a connection to the mainland. But in the last 15 years or so, that's begun to shift just as a function of generational change. And people under 40 increasingly have a uniquely Taiwanese identity, where they'll say, yes, we are sort of ethnically Chinese and culturally Chinese, but we're not politically connected to the mainland, and we want to govern our own affairs, and we have this Taiwanese identity, and increasingly they use that word. They identify as Taiwanese, not Chinese. And that's critical because that means that the PRC, despite decades of trying to win hearts and minds, has actually lost ground, which means that really the only viable option it has for reunifying or absorbing Taiwan is coercive, because as time passes, the Taiwanese people feel no affinity towards the mainland.
You bring up an interesting perspective because if you look at just geographically, right, Taiwan's very close to China. They don't have far to go. Obviously, there's some issues with deep water vessels close to Taiwan. There's not much you can do there just based on the geography. You bring up an interesting question, which is the human geography. So I guess, will they invade Taiwan? Who knows? But my actual real question is, can they invade Taiwan? And what do they have to gain? Let's say they invade Taiwan, and then the people are like, yeah, we're not building these semiconductors for you. Sorry. Like, we don't belong here. Or they flee. They go to the Philippines, or they get out of Dodge, like what is there to gain from just, can coercion alone be enough to control a population to make them do what you want them to do?
Yeah, that is a great question. And for those who are thinking about military planning, contingency scenarios, and deterrence, the question of will to fight is especially strong. Again, we have the example of Ukraine, where I think many people thought that Ukraine would fall very quickly and that the Ukrainian military and people would not resist, and they would be foolish to resist a Russian juggernaut. And yet they were proven so very wrong by that. And so these are the kinds of things that are really difficult to answer. You don't know until, I suppose, a military and a people are tested. And to a large extent, Taiwan could not hold out by itself. It would be utterly reliant on the United States and the United States' allies and partners in that region to survive if the PRC decided to invade. And if it was clear that aid was not forthcoming, then the Taiwanese people might, in fact, choose not to resist. And that's not a position we want to put anyone in. We want to preserve their freedom of options, I suppose, and allow them to control their own destiny. But it's a David and Goliath story. You've got 1.4 billion people on one side and 24 odd million people on the other. The world's largest military on one side and a very small, relatively underfunded military that's falling behind technologically on the other. And so, yes, the PRC, if it wanted to, could take Taiwan in several years once it develops the amphibious landing capability. There potentially would be a high cost. And so it's really a question of would Xi Jinping be willing to bear that cost? Right. I will say rhetorically, he has made it very clear that it is his intention to absorb Taiwan. And in some sense, the PRC has been talking about this really for more than 70 years, that Taiwan is the last piece of unfinished business from the Chinese Civil War. But it's become more insistent, more real, more urgent under Xi Jinping.
So I want to just touch on this a little bit more. There's so many great topics to get to, but when I talk to military commanders in the Indo-PACOM region, their big focus is partnerships and these global partnerships. Who are our key partners in that region, and who kind of brings the most to the fight in regard to thwarting China's advances?
So you have to remember that the United States in that region does not have a NATO-like architecture in which it's sort of, all for one for all, but rather we have a series of bilateral relationships with nations in the region that are largely about preserving mutual defense bilaterally. So we have a U.S. mutual defense treaty, for example, with Japan. We have one with Korea. We have one with the Philippines. And so those are our bilateral allies, and they are not treaty bound to come to the defense of any particular other member. Their relationships are all sort of straight lines to the United States and not necessarily lateral. So it's a choice that they would have to make about whether they wanted to get involved in the fight. Now, having said that, the United States would be highly reliant on our infrastructure facilities in the Western Pacific, in particular Japan, and possibly also the Philippines, though we don't quite have what we used to have in the Philippines, in order to mount any assistance to Taiwan defense or intervention in a conflict. And so there is a question about the extent to which Japan would be willing to allow us to use our facilities to participate in a conflict at the risk of Japan being dragged into a war. Or on the other side, the extent to which Japan would actively participate as a combatant. And that's a choice a Japanese government would have to make. But the United States plus Japan as active combatants would be formidable because they have really complementary interoperable security architectures and orders of battle. And we've been exercising for a long time together. Right. A lot of people don't realize that actually the nearest Japanese island is, I think, about 80 miles away from Taiwan. So they have a front row seat if there's any conflict over Taiwan. And in fact, Japanese public opinion really shifted in the last few years, where in a series of military exercises after Speaker of the House Pelosi went to Taiwan and the PRC expressed its extreme displeasure by having military exercises around Taiwan and firing missiles into the ocean. Some of those missiles overflew Japanese territory and landed in Japanese waters. And that was a tipping, an inflection point in which the Japanese public said, we don't like that. And it really changed opinion on the extent to which China represents a threat to Japanese peace and security. But so those are the key partners. It's Japan and the Philippines in particular, but then it's also Australia and Korea. And we have to think that if there's a conflict between China and Taiwan, there's always the possibility that North Korea takes advantage of the fact that the U.S. is distracted and we're already involved in Ukraine, and then does something on the Korea border as well. So it's very easy for it to get big fast.
Okay, that's interesting. I know one of the biggest struggles in that region with partnerships is information sharing, intelligence sharing. It's been a long-standing issue with the United States and working with allies and partners about, how do we declassify certain things and classify certain things and share that with our friends and partners in the region. But speaking about information sharing and gathering, I want to talk a little bit about TikTok, because TikTok, I'm sure you probably don't have a TikTok, Glenn, but TikTok has 170 million users in the United States. That's far superior to any other social media platform. And if you look at the usage times as well, way through the roof. Young people are using TikTok in droves. And of course, the reason why there's currently seeking a ban is because there's a belief that China is using TikTok.
TikTok.
Use Tic Tacs too. They use Tic Tacs for the breast and TikTok to spy on U.S. citizens, or at least gather data. Is there any evidence at all supporting that? And then do you think it's strong enough that TikTok should be banned in the United States? And then even furthermore, what are the broader implications? Why would China want to do business with us if every time they have a new app or a new device or something like that? DJI is a massive drone manufacturer that's destroying all American drone manufacturers. And anytime that they have a new product, a new device, a new technology, if they can't access our market because we just say, no, they're using it for intelligence gathering, what are the implications there?
That is a great question. So let me start on the back end of that, and then we'll get to the TikTok and whether it represents risk for the United States. I think TikTok, BYD, BGI, the drone makers, these firms are all laying to rest the really misguided presumption that China only succeeds by stealing and cannot innovate. In fact, what distinguishes China as opposed to our previous nations we regarded as near-peer competitors is that it is a fierce competitor. If anything, it is proving itself to be more nimble than our market-driven economies. And we are struggling to keep pace with the level of innovation coming out of there in particular areas. And we will soon see that in the biotech space too. China's invested enormous amounts of money into ensuring that it scales the biotech pinnacles of technological dominance too. So think about pharmaceuticals, which is an area that the U.S. has dominated for decades. We may be in a race now in biotech and pharmaceuticals and genomics as well. So let's put to rest that China cannot innovate, because China now has firms that are globally competitive with the best that anybody else has to offer. And TikTok is a great example of that. TikTok is a great example of how they can have a domestically closed, highly censored and policed information sphere, and yet create products that globally can take on the best that anybody else has to offer. And so you raised the question, and I think it's an important one, particularly at this moment in U.S. politics. How do we deal with that? Do we retreat into Fortress America, build the walls high and hide behind them? Because all of these, maybe there's unfair competition, maybe there's CCP control of these platforms so that they all pose risk, and abandon the rest of the world to these platforms or products, secure in the knowledge that Fortress North America is safe. Or, and I think that's a dead end, it's a land of diminishing returns. And the irony, of course, is it turns America into this little autarkic island that resembles what Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union used to be, while China is active globally around the world and seizing markets. We don't want to be in that position. Our car makers, our computer companies, our high-tech companies and pharmaceuticals, and you just name the industry, if we retreat to Fortress America, they will shrivel, they will wither, they will be under less competitive pressure to innovate, and we will find that they fall further and further behind. So I think it is the wrong approach for us to do that. Instead, we should tackle them head on and do the best we can to compete and figure out what role government and industry can play together to overcome the unfair competition that China, in fact, engages in. But you know what? China's not going to change. We can complain about it till the cows come home. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And retreating behind tariff walls is really not the right approach. Now, with regard to TikTok, It is my own belief that TikTok poses an extreme example of a much broader challenge in social media. It's not as if misinformation, disinformation, and manipulation of the electorate is unique to TikTok. We're seeing this across a spectrum of social media platforms. And in fact, many of the campaigns that exist on TikTok have analogs or in fact are happening in parallel on the other platforms
Right.
because the goal really is to reach the widest audience to have that impact. And so it would be better if the United States had a more comprehensive policy regarding data privacy, ownership of platforms, and transparency, rather than doing a whack-a-mole approach, which is what we've basically done across from one sector to another, saying TikTok's a problem, we'll just go after TikTok. BGI is a problem, we'll just go after BGI. BYD is a problem, we'll just go after BYD. We need a more comprehensive approach because today TikTok, tomorrow something else. And the danger is, unfortunately, this was recently addressed in legislation, we could have banned TikTok, but the markets for private data that exist in the United States that were until quite recently relatively lightly regulated made it such that, fine, ban TikTok, but malign players from abroad could enter the U.S. market and still buy all of the data and use it for malign purposes because we don't have overarching data regulation. So we've got to solve that problem comprehensively too, rather than going after sort of these individual actors swatting at flies.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is, yes, they're spying on us, but no, it doesn't matter because they can purchase the data elsewhere or get it through other means. And I actually agree with you because if you look at your phone, I mean, I don't know how many apps I've downloaded over the years for stupid things. I see apps on there like, I don't know where this came from. Like, what is this app doing? And I think that's probably most people, right? Is you download an app or you put something on your phone, you don't really think about it. I feel like that's
I think it does
true.
matter that TikTok is, by all evidence, at least indirectly owned and controlled by an entity that is adversarial to the United States and that it is so influential. It does put it in a sort of class by itself, but I think we still need a broader based approach to it. And TikTok, yeah, it clearly, I mean, you just have to look at Romania's recent election, where a candidate came out of nowhere. In fact, he wasn't even a real serious candidate. It was a person who literally popped out of nowhere and then suddenly ran away with the election because of a TikTok campaign. That's chilling. It is about more than TikTok. It is about also, I think, that particular candidate met a need in the Romanian electorate that was unmet by the traditional political parties. Let us also focus on the kind of social alienation, the problems that I think emerged in our electoral campaign about how people feel like their needs are not being met by traditional politics. If we can do that, if we can be a more responsive democracy, then the ability of malign actors outside to influence us and to manipulate the electorate will be diminished.
You mentioned Romania, and Romania has to completely redo their entire election because they looked at 80,000 plus cyber attacks, and you talk about this influential TikTok campaign. They've basically elected a very pro-Russian candidate, so they're going to have to redo the whole thing. I want to flip over, though, and talk about what you're doing regarding research. I mentioned one of the issues that we have with China is that they steal so much, and we can talk a little bit about how they're doing that or why they're doing that. You're involved in a program that's funded by the National Science Foundation called the Secure program. I wonder if you could maybe tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the great strengths of the United States for decades has been its immensely open and productive research infrastructure, particularly at universities where they do fundamental research in things like everything from cosmology to genetics to financial technology, computer science. You just name all of the departments. And of course, I come from the humanities and social sciences. There's a lot of great work being done there. So our immensely productive research infrastructure in universities and industry that drive the U.S. economy, that help us solve the problems that really matter, that the new technologies, new solutions to human problems. This is what's been so vital and dynamic for the United States for decades. However, for decades, we had an open policy because it was the luxury we enjoyed of having a predominant position of being the world leader. We felt like we could share everything with everyone. And in particular, by modeling that good behavior, we could encourage others to behave in similar ways. And most of our traditional partners were other liberal democracies. And so that seemed like a no-brainer, countries like Germany, Japan, the UK, Canada, France, and others. But then suddenly out of nowhere emerged countries, non-traditional traditional research partners that had really different political systems, really different visions of the kind of world that they wanted to live in. Many of them were one-party states, highly authoritarian. And China was the leading example of those. And for many countries, China is the leading, if not one of the leading, if not the leading research partners. It is for the United States. Far and away, the amount of international collaboration done with partners in China equals roughly the next two countries put together, the UK and Germany. And if you count those four countries, the U.S., China, UK, and Germany, you have the world's research superpowers. But China has a different set of goals. It's seeing this as an opportunity to absorb the best international research and use it as instruments of national power, for which China then has ambitions to develop military technology to push the U.S. out of the Western Pacific and to enhance its position in the world in ways that might be antithetical to our interests and values. And so the challenge really has been, how do we exist in a world which is growing more complex, in which our traditional liberal democratic partners are being joined by non-democratic authoritarian partners who have different visions of the world? How do we cooperate in that more complex environment to continue to drive innovation and research? And to what degree do we have to modify our earlier paradigm of radical openness? The Secure program tries to solve this problem by developing best practices and good data to help people make better decisions and help guide their thought processes and sort of institutional decision trees about how do we collaborate internationally with a given partner? How do we think about these really complex problems so that we can exercise the academic freedom, the institutional autonomy that we have in ways that are wiser and perhaps take on a broader set of interests, national interests, than has traditionally been the case. And it's really important that this is not happening within government, but it's happening within the research community, giving them the opportunity to help come up with solutions that make sense to them and that will be operable within their own institutions. And this is a 5-year project, and we're just getting started on it. It's really exciting. It's a big challenge, but we hope to make progress very soon.
Man, that's really interesting. In the intelligence community, we operate in SCIFs, right? Secure Compartmented Information Facilities. And for a long time, I've always seen these parallels between research institutions and the intelligence community. And I think that the Secure program is really interesting. And like you said, it's a newer thing. But I could totally see a future where we have SCIFs in all the major universities across the United States. That way we can leverage and access the brain power from university research and from all the smart people at these universities. If something were to ever happen, I'll tell you one of our biggest issues is just getting the knowledge to the right decision makers, because we are so limited on our TS networks and our secret networks as to where you can access them and how you can get the information out. It's actually, to me, I think it's worth looking at, probably a D&I type issue. So that's very good. I talked to a lot of students. Actually, sorry, I wanted to shift over for a second. I talked to a lot of students because of my wife. She has multiple international students, and I ask about the other students and all that good stuff. And I had a few of them mention to me that the Chinese students cheat. Do the Chinese students cheat? This was the context. I was told that, this is by multiple people have told me this, that when the Chinese students come to the United States, they have basically a mentor or a partner, a previous Chinese student who has all of the materials for them, will basically hand them all of the work that they're about to do for that semester. And they have like a team approach to passing university, getting better grades. Is this something, have you heard of this, or is this crazy?
I have heard of this. Look, some students cheat, right? It's not like Chinese like some students cheat. There will always be students who cheat. I think it is incredibly important and should be baked into every program that has international students to, in the process of orienting them when they arrive on campus, acculturate them to what the rules of good behavior are in the United States in this academic program. Because often that is not done, and cultural practices that would be acceptable or behaviors that would be overlooked in one country may not be acceptable or may not be overlooked here in the United States. And we can't assume that people will know that, will want to disabuse them of habits that they may have picked up in their countries that are incompatible with our standards of academic integrity. And that's on us to do in the beginning, because you can't expect people to know what the rules of the road are if anyone's ever driven in a different country, right? There are the formal rules and the informal ones. And so we've got to educate them up at the outset to ensure that they understand what is considered good academic citizenship. Now, having said that, the Chinese system is such that it is brutally competitive, and students and even academic faculty will often take shortcuts simply because if you see others doing it, you'll be a sucker if you don't try to leverage the same advantages, because the system is metric driven, extremely achievement driven. And so if you want to have opportunity, and very few opportunities too, given the number of people in it.
Right.
And so it produces, that has perverse incentives, which produces the kinds of behaviors that you described. And I think it's up to faculty to adjust their courses in ways that make it more difficult to do that. We're facing that anyway in the classrooms across the board now with generative AI, in which students are maybe not putting the same individual effort into their essays as they might have a generation ago, because the generative AI can do the heavy lifting for them. So you've got to adjust to ensure that the integrity standards are maintained.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because my daughter has to do this presentation to her class. She's in 4th grade. And I try to tell her that the material, the PowerPoint, the poster, whatever you're presenting, that's not what's being presented. What's being presented is you. When you go out there and you're presenting a subject, that's just the material. That's the backup. With all this push with generative AI and all that stuff, I think it's really important for students and really anybody in industry, wherever, to understand that when you're presenting something, you're presenting you. You're not presenting the topic. It's you, your knowledge. And I think that the academics think this way as well. So when they start having exams and research papers, all that stuff, they start relying more on oral presentations. I think oral presentations are an absolute great way to go for students. But
I mean, the hard work is where the learning actually happens, right?
That's right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You mentioned a couple of things about the societal norms of China and how this pressure cooker of competition could kind of lead people to doing some less than kosher things in our eyes. What are some of the other maybe societal norms that in China that the United States is less familiar with?
There is a widespread sense that China is a highly collectivist society. And in many cases, I would say that that's a misunderstanding. I've never seen the level of individualism exhibited in society that I've seen in China anywhere else. And I think that's largely a function of the fact that people sink and swim in the most urgent, sort of life-altering way on their own effort. And the unlocking of that in China 40 years ago is what has produced China's economic miracle. In some sense, China is a more Dickensian society than even sort of 19th century England, in which the social safety net is really thin. It can be an exploitative economic society. And so people have to hustle in ways that are almost unimaginable for the ordinary, comfortable American. And this is true, of course, in a lot of the world where there's a social safety net. You could without one, you could literally starve to death without your own effort. And so the level of individualism is extreme. Social trust is relatively low. But having said that, the Chinese people are immensely proud of their nation, their history, their culture in ways that I think we also should appreciate. And so when people sometimes talk about encouraging the Chinese people to overthrow their government, to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese people have complicated feelings about the Chinese Communist Party, especially in recent years because the economic performance has fallen off. But you should never underestimate the pride that they have in their own history and their culture. And we should never sort of insert ourselves as knowing better than them about what is good for them.
That's really interesting and probably a little bit mind-blowing for some people. For me especially, I've always thought of China as like this collectivist society, and that's the way that they think. But when you put it that way, and you talk about the sheer number of people and what they have to do to stand out, and I could see that creating a more individualistic society. What are some of the internal struggles in China that maybe we don't quite see? I know that they have a declining birth rate. I'm sure that they're doing things to address that. What are some other internal struggles within the country that maybe aren't as apparent to us?
Large sections of China are running out of water. Economic growth has been extremely wasteful of water resources, and the growth of immensely large cities and development and all without regard to the conservation of resources has really taxed their hydrology. And so large sections of North China, where Beijing, for example, the capital is, and many other large cities are among the driest capital cities and major cities in the world. And so the Chinese government is contemplating major water diversion projects from all the way clear on the other side of the country in order to feed the thirst of these cities as the water table really kind of disappears and ground starts to subside. This is the kind of thing which is economically probably unviable, but the Chinese government doesn't think in the dollars and cents terms. It's about keeping those cities as going enterprises. So water is one. You mentioned the demographics. It's becoming acute now in ways that are just impossible to hide, that the demographic pyramid of China is basically inverted. So there's very few young people now supporting a growing older population. And 20 or 30 years ago, China's last baby boom was at the end of the 1960s. And so it was that generation which, at the height of their working age productivity, drove China's economic miracle of the last 30 years. But now they're in their 50s and they're beginning to age out and become sort of net draws on the system rather than contributors to it. And so economically, also with regard to military manpower, the cohort of young men available for recruitment into the army is really going to acutely drop off. But in a population of 1.4 billion, they can still field a very large army. That's another area. The limits of their growth model. For decades, they could simply invest more and it translated into economic growth. But for about the last dozen years, their total factor productivity has been stagnant or declining, which means that they're not getting greater returns for their investment. And in fact, each dollar of investment is now returning just a fraction of a dollar in actual economic growth. But they haven't found a way to reinvent their growth model. And so they're doubling down and they're burning more money for less return. So this is a huge issue. And that's what's really supported the legitimacy of the CCP, because Chinese people got used to the idea that every year would be better than the last. It was this just straight up trajectory of wealth. And you talk to somebody who's 50 years old and they can remember the idea of like getting a watch was a big idea, let alone a black and white TV or a color TV. And now people in their 50s, especially in the cities, are living just as well, if not better, than people anywhere else in the world. And so within their lifetimes, the transformation has been extreme, but China seems to have hit a ceiling now. And young people, there are very few jobs, the unemployment rate is very high, and young people are beginning to despair that what was available for their parents' generation will not be available for them. This is perhaps, it's unclear right now, but this is something that the party should be very worried about, disaffected young people.
You mentioned some of their economic struggles.
Yeah.
Will tariffs be a good, let me phrase this differently. Are tariffs a good tool to use as leverage against China? When dealing with China, I should say, as a good tool to create a better deal for our relationship with China, whether that's some of the things I mentioned with research. Are tariffs a good tool to use as leverage to get what we want out of China?
I'm glad you mentioned the research piece, because up to this point, a lot of the U.S. response to the challenges that China poses are responses that involve the negative side of the equation, sort of denying China, slowing down China, blocking China. And on the secure program side of it, too, there is an aspect of that. Like, how do we be more thoughtful about our engagements with China to ensure that our relationships are reciprocal and mutually beneficial? Likewise, in industry, economic competition. But a critical piece of this, the piece that we have been less successful at standing up, but I think will be the larger component of whether we actually come out in a more favorable position, is the positive side of the equation. How do we ensure that the U.S. is more economically competitive? How do we ensure that U.S. research continues to be the most productive in the world? Where do we make the investments? How do we overcome the coordination and mobilization problems? How do we coordinate with our allies and partners to create better markets in which we can sell more goods? Simply raising tariffs and retreating to Fortress America is not going to achieve that. That might be a temporary solution. It might deal with certain symptoms, but if we're worried about, let's take electric vehicles flooding the U.S. market, fine, we can protect the U.S. market. But what about the rest of the world, in which if GM and Ford want to maintain anything like their current status, if the workers in the U.S. and Canada who work for GM and Ford want to continue having the factories to work in and keep their jobs, we've got to sell cars globally. So we've got to be out in those markets with products that can compete on price, on features, on innovation. So retreating, building walls, yes, that can in limited ways be part of the solution. It can buy us time, But in the long run, we've got to address the positive side of the equation and create a vision for competition that ensures that the world continues to look to the United States, as it has for decades, as a technological leader, as an inspiration, as a model of democratic society, and as a guarantor of international peace and security. And I worry that as we retreat from, and we're understandably tired, we've spent a lot of blood and treasure around the world. But if we retreat, that vacuum will in fact be filled by a country like China in concert with countries like Russia and Iran and others. And is that the kind of world we want to live in? It's an important question, which I think we're struggling with right now as a nation.
We saw recently that China has banned the export of certain precious minerals to the United States. Is that a reaction to Trump's tariffs, or is that a reaction to the CHIPS Act, or what's your reaction to this?
So for a number of years, China has observed that the U.S. has this really intricate and sophisticated tool set for export controls and also for financial regulation. So it's, for example, monitoring the SWIFT system. And we really developed the most sophisticated pieces of that financial regulation toolkit with regard to terrorist financing after 9/11, so we could follow flows of money, but we also use it for sanctioning countries. So China has looked on as the U.S. has begun to kind of pull those levers more frequently around the world in the last decade or so. Often with regard to China, the ZTE and Huawei sanctions, for example, were a wake-up call for China. So they have been saying, we need to develop commensurate tools that allow us to exercise our economic power in ways that advance our own economic interests and, in fact, maybe deter the unilateral U.S. and European action. So China has begun to create those tools. Those rare earths and mineral export controls that were adopted were, in fact, in response to some of the technology curbs, in particular the 2022 semiconductor export controls that were adopted that were meant to kind of cut off China's access to the highest end semiconductor technologies. China adopted in response to that some mineral export controls, and now it's gone further in response to the intensification of our attempts to limit their access to technology. It's gone further down that road by trying to block transshipment of those critical minerals. So there is a tit for tat going on here, for sure. Right now, the U.S. has more leverage, but China's realizes that and is rapidly trying to equalize the playing field.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you don't have a lot of leverage in a negotiation, you got to create some somewhere, right? Maybe that makes sense that they would do that in response. And I'm sure that with the new administration coming in, there's going to be all sorts of new levers that are pulled by the new administration that weren't pulled by the current one. Yeah. Just real quick on that, what are your thoughts on a Trump administration and their relationship to China versus a Biden administration and their relationship to China? Like, what changes there? What's good? What's bad?
So it's an interesting question because I think it's which Trump administration are we talking about? I work very closely with a number of veterans of the first Trump administration, and they played a critical role in pivoting American policy towards China. I think being more realistic, that the hope that China would play the role that we wanted it to play in the world was perhaps unrealized, and that we needed to rethink our policy towards China. To a remarkable degree, I think it surprised a lot of people, especially the Chinese government. The Biden administration maintained a lot of those original Trump policies and general orientation towards China. So there was a lot of continuity and consistency from the first Trump administration through the Biden administration in ways that people did not expect. The next Trump administration is a question mark. Will it be a kind of continuation of certain paths that were begun in the first administration, or will he take things in a new direction? I think it's really unclear what will happen. It's a new set of people in the important policy roles. We'll have to see exactly what influence that they will have. There's the possibility that they intensify and travel further down the road. Right. But there's also the possibility that they strike in a rather different direction. I don't know.
Right. Well, that's good. Nobody can predict the future, right? So I see these people on the news, this and this and this is going to happen. Look, people, no one can predict the future. Just chill out. You can try to speculate based on history and data and all that good stuff, but really nobody can predict the future.
You can say that there are some key people in the administration who have a record of being China hawks in a fairly conventional way. Yeah. But then they work for a boss, the president, who has a record of being more transactional and being willing to cut deals. And so it's a complex chemistry, and the boss ultimately is going to be the one who makes the decision. That's the president's role in our system.
Yeah, and probably one of the most outsized roles of the executive branch is foreign policy. They have more say over foreign policy than really anything. Previously, you mentioned how we leverage our dollar right? Sanctions and things like that. And I think we go overboard with this all the time. We overly sanction things, and that causes countries to retreat. Maybe I was hoping you could talk a little bit about BRICS. What is BRICS? Should we be concerned about it?
This is a great question. What is BRICS? BRICS is a really loose club that different nations have signed up for different reasons, largely because they have a grievance or something that they're unhappy about with regard to the way that the international financial and economic system is currently organized, which is favored. And of course, it was set up in the wake of World War II by the victorious European North American powers. And so BRICS are countries from the global south, largely, or the developing world, plus Russia, that feel like that system is not fully serving their interests. And it's become a loose club in which they articulate visions of alternatives. How could we reorder the international system in a way that's more responsive to our needs? Now, having said that, they all want different things out of it. And so one should not think of it as this tight alliance. It means different things to different partners. That was really clear in the most recent BRICS summit in Kazan, at which Putin announced a desire to pursue a BRICS currency that would be parallel to the dollar and create a sort of separate parallel international payment system independent of SWIFT to serve the interests of nations that took exception to the fact that the U.S. has outsized control over the global financial system. And he was kind of left all by himself by the other members who kind of took a step back and said, not so sure about that.
Right.
Yeah,
You control over that system, right?
Yeah, and you can understand why Putin would feel that way because he's been locked
Right.
out of the international financial system,
Sure.
right, as a function of the war in Ukraine. But the comprehensive financial sanctions adopted against Putin did make other countries say, we wouldn't want to be on the receiving end. No country should have that much power over the international system as the United States does. And so what the U.S. needs to do is find maybe a balance or bring more countries along so that when we exercise that power, they don't feel like someday it could be directed at them. And we begin to earn more trust. By pulling on that lever of sanctions, I think we've made countries begin to look for alternatives. But there really aren't any right now. Dollar markets are too deep. They're too liquid. They're too open. We have rule of law. We have advanced capital financial institutions. So for the moment, we are sitting in the catbird seat. It's going to take a lot for someone to mount a comprehensive challenge to dollar dominance. And I don't see anyone in that position now. They might nibble around the edges. They might create particular pathways or currencies to serve particular purposes. It's very likely that some of these currencies would function kind of like a dark web of international finance, right, in which things like international arms dealing, transactions in sanctioned commodities like Iranian oil or Russian oil would happen off the books using these currencies, but they wouldn't pose a comprehensive threat to the status of the dollar globally.
Well, you certainly make a good case for Bitcoin. I mean, that's what it sounds like to me is, maybe they don't want
some of that too.
Yeah, they don't want to centralize control over their currency, which makes sense to me. If a foreign country, I don't want another country to have control over sanctioning individuals in my country. That seems insane to me, and I get that. So in BRICS, though, you have Russia and China involved there. What is the real threat of a Russia-China alliance overall?
Right. So there's a diversity of opinions on this question. Russia and China have a relatively long history of neighborly friction. There's not a tremendous amount of love between the two countries, but it's a marriage of convenience now. Each has its own grievances, largely with the United States, but also with Western institutions and systems, and would like to see them changed in ways that benefit it. And they find it, I think, convenient to cooperate in this regard. And in particular, if you're China, for example, the longer the Ukraine war goes on, and Russia is basically on life support provided by China, and to a lesser extent, India. Without that support, the Russian economy and Russia's war machine likely would be experiencing really acute shortages right now, and the war might look quite different. But China is keeping Russia on life support without sort of actively getting involved in the war in order to tie up the United States and Europe and allow them to deplete their energies and resources, military stockpiles in that war, which relieves pressure in the Western Pacific for China and gives it, I think, a freer rein to act globally. So when you think about China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, they all find it wonderfully convenient to help each other out in their own sort of special localities. And so you don't quite have an axis of evil, but you have a coalition of the willing, really, on the other side that is making life very complicated for the United States in its traditional role as a kind of guarantor of international peace and security. Look, we're active now in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in the Red Sea. We're supporting Israel in Gaza, and now Syria has collapsed. There's the question of Iran, there's North Korea, and then there's Taiwan. And that is really stretching the United States in ways that we've not been stretched at any one particular moment in time in a very long time. And all of those other players, Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, find that a really convenient place to be.
The Russia-China alliance, if it's really a thing, maybe they have agreements for certain areas.
Oh, and they do.
The thing that I think about the most is just technological exchange, right? You always hear this in the military, all of our simulations and models, they mean squat because they have a hypersonic missile advantage. And we can't shoot those down. We don't have the capability to shoot down hypersonics in mass. What are some other technology advantages that alliance might pose as a threat to the United States?
Oh my God, it's so much more complicated than that. Let me throw in something that scrambles that alliance in a way that blows a lot of people's minds. For a great many years, China has struggled to produce leading edge military jet engines. It's got relatively decent avionics and platforms for its 5th-gen fighters. But getting the engines up to the performance that U.S. engines or even Russian engines have has been a struggle for them. It's about materials. It's about engineering. So what do? They turn to the place that used to be the kind of center of Soviet military aircraft and engine design, Ukraine. And they've imported, even before the war, but still ongoing, they have highly skilled Ukrainian military jet aircraft engineers working in China to help them perfect Chinese military jet engines and adapt the technologies that they're getting from Russia. Because who understands the Russian and the Soviet technologies better than the Ukrainians?
Why does the United States let that happen? We're funding hundreds of billions of dollars. Why would we allow them to give this technology to China? Wouldn't that be a contingent part of your offer? I'd be like, we'll support you with $100 billion, but you got to stop giving China all this technology.
So there's a market for talent, really, and China just was willing to pay those engineers to come over to China and work for them. It's not like official Ukrainian government policy. No. Okay. But nonetheless, the know-how, the technology travels, right? Sure. But yes, there's also, China has bought the S-400 and aircraft systems from Russia and begun producing its own domestic variants. And so I think the technological edge between China and Russia has mostly closed, except in a few really limited areas, possibly submarines. The key thing now is that China is developing those technologies and it is scaling them in a way that we cannot match. One of the lessons, I think, of the Ukraine war is it isn't necessarily who has the most exquisite toys, because Russia is winning this thing with a mixture of old-fashioned glide bombs, not hypersonic missiles, right? It's winning this thing by being able to produce more artillery than the whole rest of the West combined, and using sort of proven technologies or off-the-shelf technologies like drones in ways that make our emphasis on things like the F-35 or particularly exquisitely expensive platforms potentially seem misguided. And this is a real question for a kinetic contingency in the Taiwan Strait. Can the U.S. simply sustain its effort long enough? Does it run out of those exquisite missiles? I just read a really interesting piece about how up to this point, the U.S. has wonderful cruise missile technology and standoff missile technology, but the ships that fire those missiles have to go back to a limited number of ports, either in Honolulu or San Diego, to rearm. And so imagine a kinetic conflict in the Pacific in which you have those ships release all their missiles, and then they have to sail 3 weeks back to San Diego to rearm, get reloaded, and then sail 3 weeks back, they're out of the fight for almost 2 months. That's not a sustainable strategy. And so they're experimenting with adaptations to allow us to rearm at sea. But it's it's our defense industrial base, which we really, I think that the gaps in it, the inattention to it, the Ukraine war has shown a light on that across the Western alliance. So we've really got to shore that up in a massive way. So you've got hypersonics, the INF treaty that the United States signed with the Soviet Union that remained in effect after the fall of the Soviet Union for decades, that limited the production of intermediate ballistic missiles. China was not a party to that. So in the period of time where we were self-limiting ourselves and the Russians were, China proliferated intermediate range ballistic missiles so that it has thousands of them pointed at targets across the Pacific. Closing that gap might be something. They have an enormous shipbuilding program beyond the ability of the United States to equal. So the question is not necessarily, do we try to match them plane for plane, ship for ship, but rather think about smarter ways to leverage our advantage.
You were talking about the focus on effective, low-cost, proven solutions. And the U.S. military does think about this quite a bit. They call it asymmetric warfare, right? We want to do things a little bit better. And we learned this from our time in Afghanistan, where the Taliban and whatever insurgent group, as they were attacking our bases in Afghanistan, they were shooting these really old Russian rockets that they found off the side of the road or wherever they got them from, super cheap, old, rusty things. They would shoot them at our bases, and we would expend $40,000 worth of ammo to try to shoot these really cheap rockets down. So the U.S. military is thinking about this quite a bit and investing in low-cost, proven, effective solutions to things like that. Drones are an interesting subject. You brought that up. I think China is way ahead of us in terms of what they're doing with drones and drone swarms. I think the United States is very good at countering UAS. We have a massive investment in counter UAS programs here in the United States. What are your thoughts on drone swarms, and are they the future of warfare? I look at these things and I think this is the future right here. You know, when you can autonomously surround a city and simultaneously you have ISR over the whole city, and you also have command and control through communication channels through the drones. You have an attack mechanism through the drones, and it's very hard to take down 4,000 drones that are surrounding your city. What are your thoughts on this technology? And this is an area where China is definitely in the lead.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Again, the lessons of Ukraine, in which drone technology has rendered traditional infantry and armor suicidal. We have to adapt our doctrine and tactics to match that in real time. And I think it's also proven that while we might have very fancy drone technologies, they've also been failing in Ukraine because the battlefield adapts so quickly. If we cannot change, do frequency hopping, for example, or create jamming resistant UAVs, then the best toys will be out of action very quickly. And I think our contractors have learned this, and the Ukrainians have kind of embarrassed us by doing a great deal with very little, because they don't have the luxury of time and they don't have the luxury of the budgets that we work with. And so we could really learn a lot there. I mean, there's no mystery to what it takes. It's changing the defense procurement process to enable more nimble competitors to enter it and create platforms.
Not a small thing.
Yeah, it is. I know. It's a beast. Exactly. Right. But that's got to be part of the solution, right? We cannot be reliant on drones that are being produced by the country that could be our principal adversary. I mean, that's also suicidal. We've got to create a nimble, domestically sourced industry and it isn't just building the drones, it's the microelectronics that go in them. Now, with regard to swarm technology, oh boy. So, going back to the secure program and the question about how do we do fundamental research in a way that's a little bit smarter and wiser, there's an entire literature in the field of AI and robotics that's happening in the open and fundamental, lightly regulated research space between U.S. academics and academics in other countries, including China, that covers the kinds of technologies that are used for AI swarms. And up until this point, there hasn't been a kind of good infrastructure for us to think comprehensively about, whoa, what are we doing here? What does this mean? What are the potential applications? The secure program is, I think, designed to help people who work in technologies like this make better choices about who they collaborate with and what the ultimate applications of that fundamental research are, because I can point, I have them on file, of examples of collaboration with academics in other countries where those foreign academics explicitly are publishing in the area of creating drone swarms to attack U.S. aircraft carriers. years. So should we be working with those individuals, given we know that this is their research agenda and priorities that are being funded by their governments? There is a very active line of research in China that is oriented towards marshaling drone swarms to overcome U.S. technological advantage in the event of a kinetic war in the region. So yeah, it's real.
Yeah, it's 100% real. And I was at a conference recently, and one of the commanders for, I won't mention the unit, but they were talking about the future of U.S. infantry is first-person view drone pilots embedded in every infantry unit, because those drones can fly at 200 miles per hour. And, you get quick access to a target, you have a good lay of the land, and you can really supply a lot of fast intelligence and deliver effects on a target very, very quickly and very precisely. If you've ever seen those FPV drones, those things are crazy. They go super fast and they can maneuver. But I think that's an interesting development. It's kind of a reaction to what we're seeing in Ukraine. You're seeing doctrine built into the United States military saying, okay, well, we need to start adapting this technology quickly. And then the other thing he mentioned was more focus on integration. So he mentioned the launch of a new integration military occupational specialty. So it's essentially an integrator job. Your job is to integrate. Your job is to take technology here and technology here, throw them together and apply them on the battlefield. I think we have some really smart people in the United States military that are looking at this stuff, and they're not just sitting on their hands. They're saying, okay, what do we need to do now to prepare for these crazy scenarios you mentioned, like U.S. naval vessels being attacked by drone swarms? I mean, that's crazy.
We need to encourage and reward a maker culture.
100%. That's it right there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because the ingredients are out there. The know-how, the resolve is out there. We just need to create the path for those people to put those great ideas together in ways. And I mean, isn't that what we like to tell ourselves America does best? Yeah. So let's make it possible for those people to do that and solve the problems that they face on the battlefield in real time.
Well, you mentioned fixing defense procurement. Now, this is something I spend all my time in, so I could probably talk for an hour on this. But I think what you just brought up is exactly the point, is that it doesn't incentivize innovation. We don't put innovation as the core of our procurement. We put things like, we want the lowest cost, low price, technically acceptable solution. We want to make sure we spend all our dollars this year. So here you go, contractor, go toil over here. Instead, we also play this game that's, I think, in many ways false and fake, where we have to pretend that, going by the federal acquisition regulations can create some type of fair environment for competition. It really doesn't. It's just silly nonsense. You're always going to have contractors with an advantage, the inside know-how, the relationships inside of an organization. And instead, I'd like to get away from that movement of focus on fairness and a focus on innovation. Who's going to innovate the most here to save the US dollar, to drive better solutions into the marketplace? Anyways, like I said, I could probably sit there for an hour and talk about that, but I want to get back to talking a little bit more about something I read the other day that I think it just kind of blew my mind. I've never really thought about this. And this has to do with illicit fishing. So I read that 17.4 kilograms per person. That's the average consumption of a Chinese citizen for fish. Okay. So each Chinese citizen consumes roughly 17.4 kilograms per person. That's like the size of a medium-sized pig. Okay. That's a lot of fish if you really think about it. China consumes approximately 65 million tons of seafood annually, accounting for about 45% of global consumption. Let me read that again because I messed it all up. China consumes approximately 65 million tons of seafood annually, accounting for about 45% of global consumption. That is a massive amount of seafood. Now, because of that, they've fished out their waters, and now they have to go push into territory and new waters that doesn't belong to them. I read an article from Yale Environment 360, okay? The article is entitled, How China's Expanding Fishing Fleet is Depleting the World's Oceans. They talk about how big their fishing fleet is compared to the United States. What I thought was interesting is that they're comparing the North Korean fishing vessels to China, the amount of fish that they can catch. And this is what it says. Most Chinese ships are so large that they scoop up as many fish in a week as a local boat might catch in a year. When you bring that type of capability for fishing into the water, you deplete the population of fish. And if you're going into other countries' territory and doing that, out of all the things I listed before, the research stealing, the intellectual property theft, all the things, right? The cheating, out of all the things, I think this is the area that could actually lead to a global war. And this is why I think that. We're talking about food, right? Food is the thing. When you get people hungry, they become angry, right? They're pushing into other countries' territory for fish because they've outfished everything. The demand for fish is through the roof in China. To me, it really was an eye opener when I read this article. I said, wow, I had no idea that they consume so much and that they were fishing in other territories. And then when you think about it, eventually they're going to fish out all those waters in North Korea, right? And they're going to have to move on to places like Philippine water. And that's where I think it gets a little crazy to me. What are your thoughts on their illicit fishing and what are the global impacts of it?
It's a great point that doesn't get the attention that it deserves in the United States. One way of thinking about this is rolling back the clock and realizing that China's profound economic growth has raised the standard of living for most Chinese people over the last 40 years. And along with that greater wealth is access to higher forms of nutrition and in particular protein. And you see this most obviously in the fact that younger Chinese are several inches taller than their parents because their diets are more nutritious when they're growing. And so many people are surprised. They have a kind of stereotype of Chinese, particularly Northern Chinese, being relatively short compared to European ancestral populations, but not necessarily true. And certainly younger people are much taller because they get much more animal protein in their diet now. And some of that is dairy, which is a non-traditional Chinese food, but younger people have been raised on dairy. So they get milk as children. They get much more beef and pork. And then they get seafood, which they have a strong taste for, particularly in coastal China. Now that with that wealth, with the appetite, the money to spend, and the technology, China has appeared as a player in the international fishing market in a way that it appears in almost every place. Sort of as, when you've got 1.4 billion people behind you, you show up in force. And China's distant fishing fleets are the world's largest now, trying to satisfy that appetite for seafood. And they've displaced Japan's fishing fleets and Korean and Taiwan in the Western Pacific. And in fact, there are regular clashes in waters that are disputed among those countries between their fishing fleets and their domestic coast guards. And so regularly you'll read about how Taiwanese fishermen were apprehended by the Chinese Coast Guard or the Chinese Coast Guard rammed a Japanese fishing vessel because they're in disputed waters. And these are in fact some of the incidents which, if not handled well, could become sparks for either deteriorating relations or a trade of blows. This happened with the Philippines recently, in which over contested islands in the South China Sea, the Chinese Coast Guard detains Filipino fishermen, destroys their boats, beats them. And obviously, people in the Philippines respond extremely negatively to that. And the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, and so it could get complex very quickly. Now, the waters of the Western Pacific, because they have been overfished for decades by countries in addition to China, are a hotspot because of those disputed territories. But China's distant deep water fishing fleets are going truly global now, such that they are dominant in the squid fisheries off the coast of South America, in particular off Peru and Chile, vacuuming up immense amounts of seafood, but particular squid in ways that the local fishing fleets cannot compete with. And you put your finger exactly on it. The local traditional artisanal fisher fleets which support communities in those countries are being put out of business, and their way of life is being changed by these technologically advanced equivalent of fishing supertankers that arrive, vacuum up immense amounts of fish, freeze them, and package them on deck. And then they get offloaded and they show up in supermarkets without ever really touching dry ground until that point. The traditional technologically less advanced countries can't touch that. So it's especially acute in the Eastern Pacific stretches near the Galapagos. It's especially acute in Oceania, the islands of Micronesia, which have the relatively well-regulated tuna fisheries, which China is nibbling around the edges of, because of course tuna is immensely prized and extremely valuable. And it's especially happening off the coast of Africa in the Gulf of Guinea, where it is destroying traditional communities that just simply cannot compete. Their boats can't travel as far. The very powerful, well-connected, rich Chinese fishing companies are bribing local officials to get them to overlook their fishing regulations. So there is an intense, almost Wild West competition for these diminishing global fish stocks.
Just that number just really stood out to me. They consume 45% of the Earth's fish. I mean, that's insane to me. Anyways.
It's a global problem. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just out of all the things, my instinct is that that's the thing that could really spark some type of global conflict, because it's dealing with food, and you just don't mess with people's food. You don't mess with their money, and you don't mess
Yep.
with their food. Those are the two things that people just will be up in arms about. Let's switch over to technology a little bit more. I mean, I know we talked about drones, but I saw this tweet the other day that was put out by Mario Nawfal. He puts out a bunch of very news focused stuff. And this is what it says. It says, tech domination, China leaves US in the dust. China's got the tech game on lock, leading in 57 of 64 critical technologies. 2 decades ago, it was just 3. Now they're leading in quantum sensors, semiconductors, drones, and a few other areas. You mentioned vaccines as well. With 24 technologies at high risk of Chinese monopoly, the global tech race isn't just heating up, it's on fire. And then it says, who will lead the future? Recently, Google, actually, I think just yesterday, they put out their new quantum chip, which is crazy to think about. By the way, their new quantum chip, Google's new quantum chip, it was just kind of an aside in the press release, but it just proved that we live in a multiverse. They just kind of threw that in there. By the way, it can do so many calculations. It can do 1 with 25 zeros after it, calculations per second. And because of the way quantum computing works, it's basically proven that we have to live in a multiverse. There's no way that it could do that many calculations at the same time. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it and learn more about that as well. So the question is this: China is leading in these very key categories. You mentioned, like, it's not just that they're stealing anymore, it's that they're leading, they're pushing in these areas. We think about quantum computing and AI. The question is, how do we seize the future? Or maybe the question is this: is whoever wins this race to quantum AI, whatever that is, who knows what that is, right? Like, we could sit here and have a conversation about who knows what that even means. I think our perception of what that means is going to be so askew 10 years from now. Do we need to be doing more to directly block China in advancing this? And if they do, what are they going to, with an AI advantage, let's say, if they do develop one? I think the United States is still good, but I think their government funds a lot more AI tools and technologies. What do we do if they win this race? This is my question. It took me a long time to get there. I want to apologize. What do we do if China wins this race to quantum AI? There we go.
There is a lot in there, so let me see if I can unpack it. The Google announcement that you mentioned is an important breakthrough in the sense of being a proof of concept. It demonstrated that particular chip has quantum advantage and quantum supremacy and has achieved something that no other chip has done. And they actually moved it beyond simulation, moved it beyond theory, and implemented. But it is sort of a one-trick pony at this point, and it is not clear whether that achievement translates into any actual practical application for the moment. It may be that the practical applications, because the field moves so quickly, emerge in 5 years for this technology or 25 years. That is where you will get fierce debates from people within the quantum community about how ripe and mature this stuff is for practical applications. Now, the most obvious practical application is in factorization problems, which have real applications in breaking cryptography. So that's definitely received a lot of attention, and rightly so. But quantum semiconductors and quantum chip technology generally is not as versatile as classical semiconductors and classical computing technologies. And so they tend to do a rather limited range of problems phenomenally well. Now, having said that, there's a lot of sensationalistic reporting about like who's out in front in which technologies or how many technologies, China and the United States. And everything comes down to the metrics you use and the methodologies that you use to come up with your findings on that. I believe that a lot of that more headline grabbing reporting is a little bit extreme, is not founded. The United States is still highly competitive, if not leading, in a great many of those technologies, though there might be particular corners in which China is out in front. But the story there is not necessarily who's like a little in front or a little behind. It's that suddenly we are in a race. And it happened almost while we were asleep at the wheel, simply assuming that what had always worked for us in the past would continue to work for us in the future because nobody had the comprehensive wealth, resolve, and ability to mobilize to challenge us. That's no longer the case. So quantums is an area which is a great example of how research security, military security, and basic economic competitiveness all come together because the United States cannot win the quantum race on its own. There are a lot of places, particularly in Europe, which are exceptionally good at quantum that continue to work with partners around the world, including those in China. And so any solution to quantum competition with China has to be multilateral. We cannot again retreat into Fortress America and simply close off collaboration between American scientists and Chinese scientists, because leading other scientists around the world will continue to work with China and will be the ones who are isolated and falling behind. We need a more nimble set of solutions there. What troubles me about the quantum race in particular is something that you could find across a lot of sectors in the United States, and that is quantum and AI in general are becoming so phenomenally expensive to do that the traditional centers of excellence in scientific research, which have been our universities, our national labs, can no longer afford to do them. And they're getting left behind, and they're being essentially corporatized by a very small number of extremely rich, well-resourced companies, whether it's Google, IBM, OpenAI, Microsoft. But it really is a handful of companies that can afford the many billions of dollars in order to drive this technology forward. And that is good so long as it lasts. In the quantum space, the hyperconcentration of development is such that if that technology does not offer the returns on investment that satisfy shareholders 2, 5, 10 years from now, those companies may pivot in another direction. They may say, you know what, we spent a lot of money on this. It turned out to be a bit of a dead end. We're going to spend our money on other things. And then the U.S. ability to stay in the quantum race will be diminished, whereas China won't be subject to those kinds of restraints and will continue to be pushing ahead. So we have I am very pro-market, but market forces also introduce certain vulnerabilities because capital can be fickle. So we've got to find ways to sustain our effort in this area that are not dependent on a handful of CEOs. And that is true also in the AI space. It's true in semiconductors and a number of others. We've become so hyper-concentrated in a few places. And the places that drove our initial innovation in the high point of American technological leadership, which were our labs and our universities, are finding it harder to have a presence in those spaces. And it's also true in some of those key technologies that while we might be on the leading edge of the research side, we're doing a really poor job of converting that knowledge into commercialized product, particularly tangible products that have to be manufactured, because we've lost the manufacturing ability and our capital markets don't reward people who are willing to take the risk on building things when you could make money on Bitcoin or social media. So consequently, the IP might be developed in the United States, but when you get to the point where you want to build a pilot demonstration project, prove that this thing is viable at scale, they have to go to Asia to manufacture it. And then you lose the IP, and not only do you lose the sort of background IP, but in the process of manufacturing it, the people who manufacture it will do process innovation, and they will improve upon your IP and take it further than you could have, and then the United States loses that. So we've seen this in industry after industry. Battery technology is another great industry in which this has happened. And the challenge for the United States is not only how do we preserve the research side of it, but how do we ensure that we fix the problems in the capital markets and the valleys of death so that innovators here in the United States can actually build in the United States, create jobs in the United States, and create those virtuous cycles of innovation here.
It's funny you mentioned the valley of death because that's something I've experienced personally. It is real. If you try to innovate for the government and create some software, it will end up in that valley in some way, shape, or form. But the question about quantum, what makes it so, not just quantum, but also artificial general intelligence, maybe I should say, if you get to a point where the AI is improving itself at a rate that is sufficient, right? If it's improving itself, making itself better, then essentially you've created a god, right? You've created something that's so knowledgeable and understands the universe in such a way that humans can't quite fathom this. My question is, if China wins that, if they get to that point where they have this AGI first, and maybe it's a simplistic way to think of AGI, there's different ways we can think about AI, but in a very simple method, do they have the will to dominate the rest of the world with the tool like that?
China, I think I would not attribute the will to dominate the world to the Chinese leadership. They certainly want a world that is congenial to their interests. They are hyper aware of the immense blood and treasure that the United States has spent managing its various interests around the world. And Chinese strategists will often write that that's not a trap that they want to fall into because it's very expensive. Now, they may stumble into it because they've developed interests around the world economically, but they're conscious of the fact that in some ways that's kind of like a burden on a nation. They would like to kind of ride the wave without having to invest very deeply in it in the way that the United States has. But if they develop AGI, it creates all kinds of questions for military escalation, for example. We've got to, and we are having those conversations with the Chinese government and with Chinese firms about escalation control, crisis control. Because when you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was human beings, in the White House, in the Kremlin, who had just a few days. A few days seemed incredibly short. Here you might have a few seconds if you don't think about these problems in advance for crisis control and ensuring that human beings stay in the loop. There will always be that pressure with AI to accelerate it because the adversary might have AI and fewer humans in the process and in the loop. The PRC is extremely concerned about the possibilities of AI because a regime that survives on information control and information dominance can't simply surrender that to an AI model. And so you see in Chinese LLMs, for example, they're highly competitive in many respects with U.S. LLMs, but they also are kind of handcuffed in particular corners that have to do with sensitivities regarding the CCP. And so I think there's a genuine question about whether the CCP's sensitivities about its political monopoly will become will have an inhibitory effect on AI and AGI. It'll be really good for particular industrial applications, but a broader base, comprehensive general intelligence, this I think would be even more threatening to the regime than anything Voice of America could put out. So,
all right. Well, you ease my fears a little bit. Okay. I'm not as worried about AGI. Maybe I'll sleep a little bit better tonight. Who knows?
Well, I mean, AGI is fiercely debated anyway about what it really means. It's almost a philosophical war between people in the AI community.
Well, keeping this focus on technology, I read this today, actually, that China has successfully invented a surgery for curing Alzheimer's disease. It's known as LVA surgery. It is performed on neck lymphatics. So far, there have been 42 clinical trials and all have been successful. You mentioned previously about not just these high-tech areas, but high-tech medicine is an area where China is actually making strides. I guess my question regarding that is, do we focus too much on human rights in the United States? And is it their lack of care for human rights, or is there a lack of care for human rights that enables them to push the boundaries on so many different medical fronts? Or is it just purely their culture of innovation that is pushing some of these things? I see all these crazy things about China, using animals and humans and all this silly stuff. But my thought is like, okay, well, why shouldn't we look at how an animal's DNA could affect the human's DNA and for certain things? What are your thoughts on this?
Right.
Medical.
That's a great question. Now, I'm not familiar with this particular
I just read it today, maybe overall.
But I will say this as a general observation, because I watched the China tech space really carefully and the innovation space. And there's phenomenal world-leading work coming out of China. But there is also a very heavy state-driven propagandization of China's innovation, such that certain things are spun much more spectacularly than, you scratch the surface and there's nothing there. It's not really there. You see this especially in the AI space and semiconductors and quantum in a lot of areas. And so figuring out how much is smoke and spin and how much is real is always a challenge. And sometimes the propaganda headlines get picked up in Western reporting that China has achieved X, Y, or Z. And we're actually carrying their water for them rather than going deeper, not realizing that there's a lot of propaganda attached to this stuff. Now, about the human rights concerns. Look, the United States developed human subjects protections because we had a history of exploiting vulnerable populations, and whether it was racial minorities, whether it was women, whether it was pregnant women in biomedical research, because people had the freedom to make unethical choices in the absence of hard and fast rules and reviews around this stuff. And those processes and protections were adopted in the 70s and 80s, largely in response to very real scandals in which people were abused. And so I would never say that we should do away with them. It's always a question of, protections are there for a good reason, but sometimes protections can, like any regulation, can inhibit innovation. And so it's always a question of balance, and it's probably good to revisit these things from time to time. But we should always keep first and forefront the fact that human beings are involved and we need to protect human dignity and privacy and the integrity of human bodies. And also the social impact of the technologies. I mean, what a different world we would live in if the people who created our social media technologies had thought for a moment about the potential negative social impact of what they were unleashing on the world. But they didn't. Market forces rewarded them for doing a particular set of things. And so now we're in the world where we worry about TikTok. We worry about the effect on presidential elections. We worry about what it does to our kids. For biomedical research in China, you have to acknowledge that China has a different set of cultural norms that are different than those in the United States and our traditional Western partners, which largely come out of Judeo-Christian ethical norms. So there are things about fetuses, about uses of DNA, for example, that might resonate differently in a Chinese cultural context. They are also beginning to build some of the protections in regulatory and statutory forms that their principal research partners have, partly to prove that they are good international research citizens, because there have been scandals in China as well. And those exist on paper. But China has a really uneven record of enforcing its formal regulations. And sometimes because there's perverse incentive structures that will reward people for achieving breakthroughs or for claiming to achieve breakthroughs, people will bend the rules, people will overlook the rules and maybe not bear the consequences. So the enforcement side can sometimes be really variable and weak, and there will be Chinese researchers who will take risks. And then sometimes, and in the case of China, this is extremely real, the ambition to rapidly scale the league tables in a particular technology, the national governmental ambition to become a world leader, will override the ethical concerns. And so there is a real question about how much they're willing to slow themselves down by playing by the kinds of human rights rules that others do. And then there are applications of biomedical research and genomic research that have direct consequences on policed populations in China, in particular Tibetans and Uyghurs, in which they do not have the freedom to consent to the collection of their DNA, which can be used to surveil them, to repress them. And so that's, I think, a great example of how when you work with non-traditional research partners who are not liberal democracies, who are authoritarian states that operate according to different standards and political ideologies, the research may seem clean and unproblematic, but that research may have applications in the context of that other nation, which you need to think about hard, that may not even occur to you in a U.S. context, because we're not in the habit of running concentration camps with millions of people in them. And the Secure program, again, is meant to help our researchers think through those kinds of problems. It is critically important as we work in a more complex international environment in which nations have different histories and standards than us, if we're going to do science with them, if we're going to do industrial collaboration and partnerships with them, to kind of take them where they are, as they are, and figure out, okay, given that, how do we work in a way that's consistent with our values and interests?
I know you have a hard stop soon, but before you go, I want to see if we can get some kind of rapid fire questions here. I have so many questions, and I feel like you've really helped me understand China a lot more. I'm telling you, I walked into this with next to no knowledge. I mean, just very little knowledge, maybe more than the average U.S. citizen, but I feel now like I have a much better idea of what China actually is. When I hear the word China, I'll have a different sense of what the nation of China is. So some quick questions for you, and then we can hop off. What are 3 books that someone can read to learn more about China?
I think a great book, Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, currently Australia's ambassador to the United States, just wrote a hard, deep look at Xi Jinping, trying to sort of educate us on who is this guy, what matters to him, what does he think about. I think that's a great deep dive into that individual. Another book is by the historian, also an Australian actually, come to think of it, John Fitzgerald, called Cadre Country, which is a short book. It's very readable, but it's a great introduction to how China and its government is organized in ways that might be really unfamiliar to the United States, that will make a lot of how China acts in the world sort of tractable for the average American reader. And so let me just offer those 2. You're giving me this cold question, and let me think on a good third one.
You're good. Send me the 3rd book, and I'll put it in the description somewhere.
For those of you who are interested in mill topics, I'm going to refer you to something we did in-house at the Hoover Institution called the Boiling Moat. And this one's great because it's a freebie. You can download the PDF from hoover.org. Just look for the Boiling Moat. It's an edited volume put together by former Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger, who's one of our fellows, that takes a hard look about what it would take to preserve peace and security and deterrence in the Taiwan Strait in military terms. And it has a great cross-section of collaborators in it. I think it probably would be very much of interest to your audience.
I will place a link to the Boiling Moat in the description. So no matter where you're listening or watching this, check out the description. I'll put a link there. You can access that Boiling Moat that he mentioned. All right. What's it like working with Condoleezza Rice?
She's a phenomenal inspirational leader who's brought a new energy to the Hoover Institution. I think it's been a real privilege to work under her, and someone who is extraordinarily gifted in so many ways. I mean, a fluent Russian speaker, amazing concert pianist, has served our country in numerous capacities. And I was reflecting the other day on how, there's certain individuals where you look at their life stories and you say they've lived for 5 lives, enough for a whole fan full of people.
Right.
She was a child during the church bombings in Birmingham, Alabama. Her father was a pastor. She remembers what that was like, Jim Crow America. She was present and played a role in the reunification of Germany when the Berlin Wall came down. She was, of course, by President Bush's side at 9/11. She has been in so many critical sort of junctures of America and is a walking kind of repository of wisdom that, like I say, it's been a joy to work for her. And I think Hoover's never been stronger as under her leadership.
That's awesome. She's definitely one of my inspirations when you think about people that are like, man, the people I like to add as my role models are people that I know are better than me. There's like certain people you're not like, she's way better than me, probably at everything. She probably runs faster than me. She probably lifts more than me. I don't know. She's definitely smarter than me. So she's definitely.
I have to say, working at Hoover, that is also a joy. Like you look in any direction and there's someone that you can learn from and model yourself on and help make yourself better. So yeah, I hear you on that.
Okay. And then this is a question that's actually just through my research online. One of the most popular questions that's asked on Google is, why did China build the Great Wall?
Right. So an important thing to understand is there is not a single Great Wall. The Great Wall is a kind of combination of a multiplicity of walls that were built over several thousand years that were never exactly connected. They were built by different dynasties, different rulers, different emperors, all for specific purposes. So the Great Wall is kind of a misnomer. I mean, it is a thing if you add up all the pieces. And so why did they build it? A lot of reasons, but one of the principal ones is North China borders an area of the steppes of Russia in which nomadic tribes lived that would come raiding out of the steppes into the sedentary agricultural plains of North China and seize their wealth, take over their cities and warfare and that nature. And so, going back historically, keeping those nomadic tribes on the other side of the wall was one of the reasons they built the wall. But very often, actually, it was more effective to simply buy off those tribes by making alliances with their leaders, investing them with titles and sending them tribute from time to time. So you bought the peace. Very often, the wall was not the barrier to invasion that some people might have thought it was. In fact, sometimes the generals who manned the wall were bribed to open the gates and let in those armies. Yeah.
Okay. It all makes more sense now. Well, Glenn, thank you so much. Amazing stuff. One last thing. How can people learn more about you and what you're doing at the Hoover Institute? Where should they go to find out more about you?
Well, thank you. Take a look at our program, the program on U.S. China and the world. It's hoover.org/USCW for U.S. China and the world. All of our work is up there. My work is up there. And I would encourage any of your audience to take a look at our resources. We do podcasts. We do regular speaker series. We do publications.
Glenn, thanks so much for being here. I'll make sure to put all that cool stuff in the description so you can access everything easily. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Nick. It's been a great pleasure.
All right.